Welcome back. So what we're going to do in this last video is focus on artificial intelligence. In the last video, I spoke about, in very broad terms, the kind of 13 technologies and business practices that Richard Susskind has identified as being disruptive to legal practice. All of those disruptive technologies could in their delivery involve some form of artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence, as you know from the second video, is really a collection of different technologies, including machine learning, big data analysis, expert systems, a range of different technologies and approaches to solving problems. And it really is kind of the sexy technology, if you will, that we're talking about a lot in the profession, essentially asking ourselves the question, are the robots going to take our jobs? There are a couple of really interesting readings in around this area, and in fact, I'm just going to go straight to the second slide in this section here. One of the books I've been reading recently is on the slide there. I think I mentioned it earlier, Professor Toby Walsh's book, Machine Behaving Badly, which is really focused on the ethics of AI. And one of the readings that you have is the introduction to Jacob Turner's book about artificial intelligence, which again is really looking at artificial intelligence from the point of view of different kind of uses and what the ethics of those uses might be. So that's on one hand. Then on the other hand, the other reading that you have in this area really asks you to think about the ways in which AI could be used in the profession. So both of those are really, really interesting issues, and they kind of meld, particularly in this subject where we're really interested in technology, ethics, and the law. And that ethics kind of fits in between. We're going to talk about ethics of the technologies as well as legal ethics. And going right back to the first week when you started to think about what your own ethical approach is, I think it's a really good idea to stand back as you think about these different technologies and the way that artificial intelligence could be used both in the legal profession and more generally. Think about what the ethical implications might be, and then using your own approach to ethics, the place where you feel most comfortable, start to think about, well, what does that mean for the choices that you will make? So there are a couple of videos on the slide on Canvas as well, which will be great resources for better understanding what artificial intelligence is and what kind of ethical issues arise. I must admit, initially when I started with the one that starts with the creepy hologram bride, I was thinking, where is this going? But I do think it raises some really interesting questions that apply to the way that we're going to see artificial intelligence used in the law. And so I commend you to have a look at that and to go to the tutorial prepared with thinking about, well, what are the pros and cons of artificial intelligence, and how might artificial intelligence, as it grows from these narrow expert systems that the focus has been on to more general AI, if that's even possible, how do you see that being used in the profession or by your clients or in the courts or in the way that legal systems work, whether that's by police or otherwise, something that we'll focus on at a more area of law basis next week? How do you see those uses evolving? And what will that mean for you as a practitioner, both at a practical level, but also at the ethical level of how you approach being a lawyer and what matters to you as your careers develop? I think we can also learn from those videos and from more general reading about what's happening with AI. We can learn a lot about how AI is being deployed in more algorithmic professions. I think the way that we're seeing AI being used for diagnostics, particularly in the medical profession, is a really interesting kind of use case that we can think about the way in which the law is growing or should develop, and the way in which we might be able to use AI in future to make sense of the law and the best approach to building legal frameworks and legal strategies. One of the uses of AI that I've found fascinating in the profession is a tool which, as far as I know, is only available in the US now. It's been bought out by one of the legal publishers, but it was built using the famous IBM's Watson artificial intelligence engine. And it effectively allows litigators to identify which kind of options of legal reasoning, which lots of case law and application is most likely to be appealing to a particular judge. And this is something we value QCs for, right? They might not actually know why they think that a particular judge is going to be more persuaded by one argument than another. It feels like gut feel, but it really is actually thousands of data points that they've collected through observation and experience that they might not be able to write down. And I think this is really important to remember as we move through, in fact, I'll change the slides here, as we move through and think about artificial intelligence in the profession. So as a research field, as we've looked at this kind of topic, artificial intelligence in the law, is something that stretched back several decades. Papers were first written about artificial intelligence in the law in the 1970s. And so it's gone back for some time, and it's tended to focus on essentially the design of computer algorithms or programs or what we call computational models that are trying to reproduce or perform legal reasoning. So an overview of, or a literature review of AI and the law would include many, many subcategories, but the focus has really been on computational legal logic. In a really early paper, Richard Susskind, who was in fact a data engineer as his undergraduate study, and he studied artificial intelligence right from the very beginning, he really kind of came up with this idea of the focus being either pragmatic or purist. So purists are really the ones who are looking at the future of AI to achieve this idea of general AI, maybe even a conscious AI capable of really replicating human intelligence in some ways, including emotional intelligence and consciousness, etc., and having intelligence that goes across many fields, as opposed to the narrow AI, which tends to be expert system or computational in a specific or particular area. Now, general AI is the sexy stuff there. That's the hologram robots that you can fall in love with. That's the stuff of science fiction. But most of the actual projects that we've seen commercialized and come to fruition have really addressed pragmatic goals. And so even though the science is all on the purest stuff, at the end of the day, the usefulness tends to be quite pragmatic. So let's have a look at some examples of that. I think one of the areas where AI has really come into its own has been in legal information retrieval. So basically, when I started as a lawyer, one of the barriers to entry was even getting access to the information, much less knowing how to make sense of that information. I think over the last 30 years, the focus really has shifted to knowing what questions to ask, because retrieving the information is easy. I often say that the big difference between an average lawyer and a good lawyer is a good lawyer knows what questions to ask. An average lawyer will have the basic set of answers, but really good lawyers will know actually what question do I ask. I mean, for you, it's like I ask you a question, okay, we're doing technology, ethics and the law. Chances are this question is about one of those things. In real life, you've got no idea whether it's even a legal problem or not, right? At the very beginning, your clients don't really know whether it's a legal problem or not often. Often, they don't have a legal problem. They have a commercial problem that has a legal aspect, or they have a dispute that they need to resolve, which involves the law. So a large part about working out how to solve a legal problem or a commercial problem with a legal aspect is actually knowing which information to gather. And there are a whole lot of uses of pretty basic AI, really, to really help us search for and retrieve legal information. I'm a big fan of Jade. If you haven't registered for that yet, I strongly recommend you do. It has some great visualization, some really great tools for finding things. And for students, the professional version is basically free. You only have to send an email to the editor from your university account, tell them I sent you, tell them that you'd like to use the professional version. And I'd really strongly recommend that you have a play with it, because it really has got some very useful features in it for helping you really hone down to the most important elements of what the cases mean or the history of the legislation, etc. All the big legal publishers, LexisNexis, Thomson Reuters Westlaw, Wolters Kluwer, CCH, are all using artificial intelligence now, particularly in the form of big data pattern recognition, to know when you ask for something what kinds of things you're likely to really be looking for, and to help you narrow that search in ways that get you to the information more quickly. And look, I tell you what, Control F even, as it were, Apple key F, depending on what system you use, to just find the key term. Honestly, the time that it used to take me reading cases to find the absolute key information, all that time is now available for you to process and make sense of the information. So I just think it's really important to really recognise the value of this kind of use of AI in making our time better. And nobody's going to say that being able to retrieve the information is getting rid of lawyers. It actually helps us do our jobs better. The other place that we're really seeing AI being used a lot is in workflow tools and document automation, particularly in insurance and for the legal practices that support insurance. But there are lots of opportunity for repetitive work to be automated and for workflows to really again, free up lawyers to do the thinking part of the job that they do best. Now, basically, workflow tools, it's pretty simple AI. A lot of it is decision-making kind of trees. So any of you who are keen on using flowcharts or mind maps will find that you're actually on your way to being expert system developers, believe it or not. One of the things that we teach you at law school is to use IRAC in going through the process of solving problems. What is the issue? What is the rule that applies to that issue? How does that rule apply? And what's your tentative conclusion? I personally like MIRAD a bit better. What are the material facts? How do the issues arise? So on. Pretty much the same thing. That is basically a decision-making process. We gather information, we sort out the rules, we apply the rules based on precedent, and then we come up with a conclusion. Again, a workflow system or an artificial intelligence system that does that is basically replicating that. Now, by replicating, I don't mean it's doing exactly the same things that you do. Artificial intelligence, while I would accept it's a form of intelligence, it's not the same as organic or human intelligence. One of the issues that you will see come up in the readings over and over again is this concern about the AI being a black box. I must admit, personally, I am less concerned about what that means than I am concerned about how we learn to recognize and address that. The analogy I'll use again is about flight. Aeroplanes do not fly the same way that organic beings that fly. They do not have wings that flap like birds and insects, but they still fly. Technically, we could call it artificial flight, but at the end of the day, it's still flight. Similarly, artificial intelligence may not actually use the same logic or pattern recognition that we as humans do, but it still comes up with a conclusion based on the same outputs. And when it learns enough about what the correct inputs are and what the correct outputs are, it will be able to replicate decision making, even if it is just in a narrow area, like medical diagnostics, for example, or it will be able to replicate a workflow in very similar ways. The fact that we can't really understand what's inside the black box, I actually think we're kidding ourselves personally if we think we can understand what is in the black box of somebody else's mind, or even sometimes in our own mind. We do not recognize our own unconscious biases. We do not recognize the extent to which we carry with us assumptions that we have always assumed to be correct, even though they may not be. Nobody ever thinks that the people who were seriously considering about burning Copernicus at the stake because he radically suggested that maybe the maths would work better if we considered the Earth as rotating around the sun instead of the other way around. Okay, we think that their solution, burning at the stake, was a bit dramatic and out of its time. We don't think they were stupid people. They just hadn't thought about the world in the same way. And frankly, I think, human thought evolves. There are plenty of opinions and things that I thought about or didn't understand the same way many years ago that I understand differently. I am, on one side of my family, a sixth generation Australian. The way I learned history is I thought I was a sixth generation Australian. Australia started when Captain Cook hit Botany Bay. Subsequently, I've learnt that my family lived on country that was stolen from people who had been there for 20,000 years beforehand. That the stories that I grew up with about my history were told very much from a point of view that was really not a point of view that I now share. I don't think I was stupid back then. I think I was lacking data and an ability to see the world in the way that I have since because of the time and attention that's been taken to help educate me about the world in a different way. Now, at risk of going off on a complete tangent, and I will try and avoid that because I'm already over time, I think we can think about artificial intelligence in this way, that it's just speedier at collecting a whole lot of data points. But we do need to be aware of what data points it might misconstrue or think about differently. And so the ethical overview is always going to be important. I didn't change the slide for those of you watching on the video, but I think that really the point I'm making here is best thought about in thinking about AI as an evolutionary force. Really, most of the AI we're seeing used in the profession is at that knowledge stage. So that idea of eliciting knowledge, whether that's as expert systems, decision trees, which is really kind of what I'm really seeing in the workflow at a practical level at this stage, and also legal information retrieval. It's really about big sets of data and bringing the most relevant stuff to the top at the right step in the process. We are seeing more and more narrow AI that is really able to copy the experts. And we're seeing this in particular in the use of due diligence and discovery, due diligence and discovery systems, which are able to use both machine learning and big data to see patterns in huge numbers of documents that seriously would have taken many people a very long time to see in the past. And again, it's actually removing what was seriously boring work for young lawyers for a long time. Whether or not we ever actually make it to that effective computing stage, whether we make it to the stage where we've got machines that detect and express human emotions, that have some kind of self-awareness, whether you in the future not only practice in human rights law, but also machine rights law, look, I can't say. I think it's highly unlikely, but one thing I know for sure about the future is it's different from today, and it's unlikely to be exactly what we predict. But what's important for you is you'll be working in the profession in the future, and you will be working with clients and humans who interface with AI systems every day. So thinking about where that AI is, where it sits on the spectrum from most narrow to most general, from least sophisticated to most sophisticated, and thinking about the ways in which it can be used both by you as a practitioner but out in the world is going to be really important for you as you navigate that world both ethically and in practice. The model that I have on the screen, I'm hoping, and it's got a typo in it for which I apologise. I will fix that in the slides that I send out to you with any luck. The model here is kind of a good way of thinking about it. The closer the AI is to being hand-coded, involving decisions and inputs of humans, the more basic it will be. The more that it learns from data and from significant inputs, and that it relates those inputs to some kind of causal reasoning, the more likely it is that we're moving towards that general AI. Most of what we're seeing in the profession at the moment really fits in that hand-coded statistical reasoning stage. So the early forays into computational modeling conceptualize the law as a kind of decision tree, as I've mentioned before, and the knowledge systems and the AI systems that we saw model that. There are limitations to these expert systems, and some of those limitations are technical, but many of them really relate to the ways in which the systems are able to represent legal knowledge. And so the more theoretical legal knowledge is, as opposed to being able to produce artifacts or demonstrate or symbolize what the legal knowledge is, the more difficult it is to see it being replicated in an AI system. And again, this comes back to the reading that you had with Richard Susskind and his word, I think he uses the word decomposing. I like this unbundling personally is a better way of expressing it, just maybe because I just don't like the idea of lots of lawyers decomposing. But really being able to identify what is the bespoke or special thing that lawyers do and what is really just manipulating data or reproducing steps that have been done before. So that's what's really important to understand, and the closer it is to that bespoke service, the harder it is to reproduce or to imagine AI doing it. There are 3 technical limitations that we need to think about: knowledge acquisition, knowledge representation, and knowledge utilization. Again, your reading really will help you unpick those ideas. But at the end of the day, this subject is not requiring you to design an AI system. It's to start to think about how AI systems might be used and what that means for you as a practitioner. So that actually brings me to the final point that I want to make. And this is really important because I think as you can get really drilled down into these different technologies and how they might be used, it can get really overwhelming. I think when we're asking ourselves the question, what tools do we need and what technologies are relevant, we need to stand back and think, what is it that lawyers are for? Now, just as you might say, well, I can use a carpenter to hammer things together and to fix things and to, drill holes in benches or whatever it happens to be. Actually, we don't really ever want a carpenter to use a drill to drill a hole. What we actually want is a carpenter to hang a picture or to put together a cot so that our baby has a safe place to sleep, or to fix the hinges on a door so that we can lock it and be safe at night. The reason why people want a lawyer is not because they want to know what the law is or what their recommendations are for solving a legal problem, or because they want to be represented in court, or because they need a contract drafted. They want a lawyer because they want to do the deal, or because they want to feel safe, or because they have a dispute that they want to resolve, or because they've been accused of something and they want the best representation to ensure the minimum consequences, or potentially they could be innocent and they need to be properly represented. So remember, what a lawyer is for and what a lawyer does are slightly different things. And when a lawyer does things, they do those things with a view to delivering the services or the outcomes that they're required ethically and professionally to deliver. And so we can get very caught up in the tools, but the tools and the way we do the work is not an end unto itself. There's steps towards actually achieving the outcomes that make us or will make us good lawyers. So with that note, I basically commend, if you haven't finished it yet, make sure you do the readings, make sure that you have a look at the videos that are on the platform, and I will see you next week when we'll dive a little bit more deeply into the way that some of these technologies are being used in specific areas of the law. Until then, take care.